Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I think this covers most of the time zones we are having now. My name is Guy Miron. I speak from Jerusalem. I'm a member of the team of Leo Baeck Institute in Jerusalem and also a professor of Jewish history at the Open University of Israel. And I'm very excited and curious also to open this special event for the book German Jewish Studies Next Generations, edited by my two much younger scholars and friends, Elyada and Kerry Wallach. The book includes a great introduction by the editors, after a good an important forward also by Frank Mecklenburg. Then 12 chapters. Each of them is an article of one of the young scholars involved in the project, and all of them accepting in the past the Westheimer's Career Development Fellowship, which was already mentioned. And then an interesting and important epilogue written by Michael Meyer, one of the most senior members of our community, who is also here among us. I can say that our community of scholars and people interested in the field of German Jewish studies is an international community. As we can see here, people are from all the time zones, at least between Seattle and Jerusalem, and maybe also we have guests from India or from Australia. People are involved in this community, and more relevant to our discussion today, or at least as relevant, it's an intergenerational community. And the book we are dealing with today is representing the younger generations. I would say at the moment the young generation, because as you know, it's always temporal. Presented in the introduction of the book as those born in the 70s and in the 80s. So as a member of the 1960s born generation, who is today maybe the middle generation, I welcome you and I'm very proud to see your great achievements. I must say that I was part of a seminar of Leo Baeck Jerusalem Institute for Young Scholars. It was, I think, a few years ago, and Kerry was one of the participants, and this is how I got to know in Berlin and Jerusalem a few years ago, and now you're already editing this this book, and part of the participants are also were part of this book. Approximately 20 years ago, we had an event towards marking the 50 years anniversary of Leo Baeck Institute, and I was then one of the younger scholars, and I think I realized then, and it was part of the talk, that the very existence of Leo Baeck Institute after 50 years is actually a miracle. An organization which was founded by refugees, scattered all around the world, aspiring to write a book of memory for their lost community, or maybe a few more articles, developed into a well-established international research organizations with more and more new young generations of scholars. And the younger the scholars are, the less they are connected specifically to this German Jewish community in a direct, biological way, I would say. And the bond is becoming more and more intellectual, and the attachments are becoming more complicated, more interesting. And if the founding father expected that this will last a decade or two, this miracle has lasted then 50 years, and today more than 70, is becoming flourishing more and more. And what we see today is part of this project, and it was fascinating to see that you are already thinking and considering what will be in 2030 and 2040. And so on. Our field is developing, as we see in the book, not only to a new generation, to many new perspectives. A field which was originally mostly dealing with history in a more conservative way is dealing with many other variety of disciplines like, of course, literature, music, cultural studies, architecture, and a variety of other fields, many of them represented in the books. In the book, many of them probably will be represented in other projects that your generation and younger generation will approach. The field is challenging more and more borders, the chronological borders, the geographical borders, the linguistical borders, which were set by the first generation of the founding fathers of Leo Baeck Institute, are always challenged in the good way. And in a way, I would say that the German Jewish history, this rich field with a variety of disciplines attached to it, is becoming one of the most fruitful intellectual laboratories for people interested in a variety of universal topics, and using this field to contribute to this to an international discussion of a variety of topics, and sometimes also in a comparative way. I think Michael Meyer related in the epilogue to the very importance of a lot of comparative studies, which are an important part of the future of this field. And last but not least, I must mention, and I think it's becoming more relevant as time goes by, how these topics of minority rights, of people approaching persecutions, of hyphenated identities and hybridities are becoming more and more relevant in the current political situation. I think in all of our time zones, of course, in Israel, in the United States, in Europe, all over. And this, I think, one of the things which are making our field fruitful and will make it, if we want it or not, fruitful also in the future. So we have today two guest speakers who will speak about the book, and then we will hear the two co-editors of the book, and I hope we have time for a short discussion in the last minutes of this Zoom meeting. So our first speaker will be Professor Avigail Gelman. She's a professor of Hebrew, German, and Comparative Literature in the Department of World Languages and Literature at Boston University. She's an active member of the Boston University's Elie Wiesel Center of Jewish Studies. In 2021-22, she was a visiting scholar at the Institute of Advanced Studies at Tel Aviv University. Avigail Gelman is the author of two books in our field, Viennese Jewish Modernism, Freud, Hoffenstahl, and Ber, Hoffman, and Schnitzler, Penn State University Press, 2009, and A History of German Bible Translation, University of Chicago Press, 2018. Her essay, Martin Buber, A Message to Post-War Germany, won the 2015 Egon Schwartz Prize for an outstanding essay in the area of German Jewish studies. She has recently published articles on diverse topics like Jewish translation history, Emma Lazarus' relationship to Heinrich Heine, and the poetics of Israel writer Aaron Appelfeld. Gelman's core research project titled Parabolic Style Across Jewish Literature traces the influence of the religious parable, the mashal, upon individual authors and movements for modernism through contemporary times. And last but not least, in her spare time, she works as an editor for the Encyclopedia of the Bible Reception and its reception published by De Gruyter. Avigail, please.
Toda, thank you very much. I also want to begin by thanking the two editors, Kerry and Aya. You deserve a lot of credit for putting this volume together, and also for the excellent introductory essay, which summarizes the history and the state of our field. Perhaps the Leo Baeck Institute could publish and circulate that essay as an independent piece. Everyone should read it. The volume's subtitle, Next Generations, inspired me to think about my generation. So permit me a brief reminiscence. As I was in college and graduate school in the 80s and early 90s, I believe I belong to the third generation, one generation after Guy. At the same time, I went into this field because of a desire to recover what had been lost. And Matthew Handelman refers to this in his essay, a world with which I had no contact, but only a negative knowledge, in that I grew up hearing so much about the destruction of German Jewry, but virtually nothing about the world of German Jews, let alone about German culture. German Jewish literature was not really a field in the 80s. In contrast, German Jewish history and German Jewish thought were well-established areas of research. What was critical for those of us in literature was not only the advent of cultural studies, with Sandra Gilman's book, a landmark work, and no, Sandra and I are not relatives, we're just friends, but before cultural studies, the infusion of Jewish texts and Jewish ways of reading into literary studies in the academy. Scholars of literature came out as Jewish critics. Midrash became connected with new criticism and deconstruction. Harold Bloom started teaching Jewish literature from J to K. And the Holocaust video archives were not only being created, they were treated as texts to be analyzed by scholars of literature and psychoanalysis. I will never forget hearing the great scholar of Romanticism, Professor Jeffrey Hartman, an emigre who left Germany on a Kindertransport, analyze the language of one of the Holocaust testimonies. Another starting point within Germanistic was Jeffrey Salmon's lifelong work on Heinrich Heine. And I had the privilege of taking a course with Jeff on Germans and Jews, the literary experience. In 1985, there were only 2 of us in the class. Jeff, who passed away in 2021, remains my inspiration throughout my career. I deeply admire the next generations of scholars in German Jewish studies for a number of reasons. First, the authors are vocal and intentional about their commitments and the context of their scholarship. In this volume, each contributor begins with a personal reflection. They discuss what motivates them methodologically and personally. I really value this aspect of the volume, and I commend the editors for including it. Second, the next generation has the skills and breadth of knowledge to do justice to German Jewish literature as a transnational and multilingual corpus. The next generation has training in Yiddish. Yiddish was not available to me in graduate school, but now there are so many working comparatively in German and Yiddish, not to mention in the thriving field of Yiddish studies. And this is a critical correction and necessary correction in our field. What has changed, as Nick Block writes in his essay, is that in the last decade, Yiddish has become institutionally a part of German studies in the American and Canadian universities. And Nick makes an important appeal, which I'm taking to heart, that faculty specializing in German Jewish studies might consider asking for a position in Yiddish and incorporating courses on Yiddish studies within a German studies curriculum. Germanists with knowledge of Yiddish are able to investigate the historic role of translation in shaping Jewish culture and to write Jewish translation history, which I believe is a project of enormous importance. Nick's chapter on Nathan Birnbaum is an excellent example. Birnbaum, an Austrian Zionist, convened the Yiddish conference in Czernowitz in 1908. He also translated Yiddish literature, such as the stories of Peretz. But Nick points out that as a translator, he curated Yiddish literature for a German readership. At the same time, for German Jews, Birnbaum represented the authentic Ostjude. Birnbaum exemplifies the ways that a Jewish translator became what Naomi Seidman calls a double agent. Yiddish translation is also a central topic in Aya Elyada's research on the reception of old Yiddish texts in modern German literature. German Jewish translators themselves were ambivalent about the value of old Yiddish texts. One important decision was whether a German translation should domesticate the Yiddish. Bertha Pappenheim's translation of the Zenarena and the Meisebuch incorporated Yiddish terms and orthography to convey the Stimmung, the flavor of the Old World. In Pappenheim's view, to render the Zenarena in Hochdeutsch would make no sense at all. It would sterilize it. A foreignizing approach retains the oral character of the original, but it also makes clear that the world of Yiddish would remain in the distant past. The text is a bridge back to the past, but not a two-way street. Pappenheim was not like Birnbaum. She did not believe Jews should return to Yiddish or speak Yiddish. She admired the world of Yiddish women's literature, I believe, because of its religiosity. sorely absent among modern intellectual Jews. Aya presents the case of folklorist Abraham Moses Tendlau, who lived in the 19th century. Tendlau took different approaches. His translation of the Meisterbuch, which he called Buch der Sagen und Legenden, was done in standardized German. But another book of Old Yiddish proverbs, Sprichwörter und Redensarten der deutsch-jüdischen Vorzeit, he did not retain the verdorbene, the Yiddish, the authentic Yiddish, and used Yiddish in transliteration, if I understand correctly. And that makes sense in a way, because proverbs, Sprichwörter, like pitgamim, they don't translate well. They're idiomatic and onomatopoetic. As I am working on the history of the mashal and proverbs, this topic interests me, and I look forward to your book and hope you will help me with it. Though not present in this volume, I must mention here that it is not only Yiddish, but Hebrew language and literature, which have become part of German Jewish studies, a critical part. Last year, when I was visiting at Tel Aviv University, I was really impressed with how many young scholars and doctoral students are working comparatively in Hebrew and German. In Tel Aviv, just to give one example, Michal Peles Almagor, whose dissertation won the Leo Beck Dissertation Prize last year, writes about the question of belonging and home in modernist novels written in Berlin and Vienna, in Hebrew and German, juxtaposing Shai Agnon, David Fogel, Leah Goldberg with Walter Benjamin and Arthur Schnitzler. The notion that Jewish writers of the 20th century have multilingual oeuvre has become the norm. And this premise considerably expands the terrain of the German Jewish. It also transforms the practice and theory of what we do as literary critics. And I want to call your attention to Leslie Morris's important book, The Translated Jew, which is subtitled German Jewish Literature on the Margins. If a translator is a double agent, another kind of double agent is the narrator of the fascinating novel by Edgar Hilsenrath, Der Nazi und der Friseur, whom Corey Twitchell, writing in this volume, calls a disfigured narrator. I quote, Hilsenrath disfigures his characters and the stories his narrators tell as a way to investigate complex ethical questions raised in the post-war period related to Nazi aggressors and the victims of National Socialism. Corey introduces the ethical question of unsettling the firm boundary between who is a victim and who is a perpetrator. With respect to boundaries, something that surprised me is that the authors in this volume pose the question, does my project qualify as German Jewish studies? Is it German enough? And others, such as historians working on Judaism and modernity, wonder whether their paradigm is too German. Is German Jewish history a mirror of modernity, as Gerson Cohen wrote many years ago? But why are these questions important? The national boundaries matter, not only as a disciplinary debate among scholars, but because national identity was so precarious in the lifetime of our subjects. And I learned this from Kerry Wallach's chapter on a forgotten artist, Rachel Shalit Marcus, one of the most important Jewish illustrators of German periodicals, who also illustrated works by Sholem Aleichem, Mendele, Heine, Bialik, Thomas Mann, and others. Like Marc Chagall, Rachel Shalit was born in Eastern Europe, yet she lived in Germany for 20 years, producing works for German speakers and periodicals. In Germany, she was considered a foreign artist. And Kerry writes that in an exhibition catalog from 1934, she is regarded as formerly from Berlin, now in Paris. So do we consider her a German artist? Shalit was deported was deported via Drancy to Auschwitz in 1942. Her apartment in Paris was plundered, and much of her art was lost. Mapping her life and work in Germany and France becomes an incredible project of restoration, not only because of her lost oeuvre. As an illustrator, much of her work is in newspapers, ephemera, not in museums. And women artists, in any case, continue to be excluded from surveys of Jewish art. Kerry said that she traveled to archives all over to track down the images of Shalit. And I have to say that establishing these kinds of networks through geography and using digital means is another area in which the next generation excels. Stephanie Mauer's essay on Dr. Berta Ottenstein is not only about the life of an eminent Jewish dermatologist, but about the social networks of the exiled physician after she left Germany. It extends also to the history of medicine, in particular, the fate of emigre physicians and scientists, also with implications for how immigrants are treated today. Matthew Handelman's networks can trace the circulation of ideas in correspondences among Margarete Sussmann, Siegfried Krakauer, Martin Buber, and others. They connect the pages of the Feuilleton Frankfurt and highbrow philosophical debates about the absence of God in modern times. These networks make Margarete Sussmann's role newly visible. It's a whole new way of doing intellectual history. The spatial turn enables scholars to expand the field in critical ways to incorporate women's lives and biographies, still often an afterthought or ignored. I want to refer to three essays that refer to what I would call Jewish religious culture. I found Tina Fruhoff's essay on Cantor Kurt Messerschmidt to be extremely powerful. And I love Chazanut, and any article about the history of Jewish synagogue music and Chazanut is I loved reading it. But Cantor Messerschmidt, when he left Germany, he came to the US and served in a synagogue in Portland, Maine for 34 years, dying just a few years ago at age 102. But before that, he was deported during the war. He sang for inmates in Terezin and Auschwitz. He performed for Nazi officers. But after the war, he participated in the first synagogue service in Munich, the first Rosh Hashanah service in Munich in September 1945. And also what's incredible is that he began broadcasting every Friday night. There would be a broadcast religiöse Feierstunde every Friday night for 15 minutes. And he would sing and perform in his sharing Jewish music, not only for the DPs and for German Jews, but German-born Jews, but it became very popular among German audiences. Also very moving to me was a chapter by Stephanie Fisher about mourning practices after the Holocaust. She notes that historiography has failed to take account of cemeteries and issues around the upkeep and the ownership of cemeteries and the feelings about the dead in those cemeteries of the emigres. She writes, ironically, the dead in those cemeteries survived the Holocaust, and they provided a connection to the family life before the war. And she studies the correspondence, the letters written by emigres back to Germany, inquiring about the fate of their relatives' graves. Finally, I would highlight one idea in Joshua Shane's research article on the history of Orthodox Judaism. Shane's makes a fascinating point, noting that Orthodoxy may position itself as a continuation of pre-modern Jewish life. And perhaps outsiders regard Orthodox Jews, their languages, their behaviors, their dress, as fixed in the past. Joshua Shanes writes, quote, "In reality, orthodoxy is no less a product of modernity than its religious and political counterparts. And this is not only because neo-orthodoxy in Germany began as a reaction to reform. Beginning in the 19th century, Orthodox Jews negotiated and redesigned Jewish values and practices and political alliances, just as the other movements did and continue to do today in the US and in Israel." And this point resonated with me very much because of my work on Samson Raphael Hirsch's translation and commentary on the Torah, which was an unbelievably creative, even shockingly creative project. So I close with just a word to the next generations. You are already fulfilling the promise and potential of the rich types of training to which you had access, with new areas of expertise, disciplinary innovation, creative projects. You are taking German studies in so many new directions. German Jewish culture, one might say, has become world literature. It circulates and has an impact and relevance beyond the German language sphere. And that is something to celebrate. And thank you for inviting me to be part of this celebration.
Thank you, Abigail. This was a very interesting overview. And I found myself thinking, while you related to Yiddish becoming an integral part of the field, I think it's a very fascinating observation that whereas maybe the first generation of scholars of German Jewry after the Holocaust were dealing with Trauerarbeit, maybe this younger generation is doing what we can call tikkun, which means, something which was broken already in the history of modern German Jewry is reuniting in an interesting way.
Absolutely.
And this has to do with what is mentioned in the introduction, that some of the younger scholars are dealing with what you defined, Aya and Kerry, as minor figures. But through these minor figures, so to say, there could be achieved a more intimate and a more personal and a deeper engagement with the history of German Jewry, rather than dealing with those big figures which were already discussed in big topics. And this, of course, has to do also with what we call the cultural turn, which is always in the air when we deal with these topics. So thank you for this. And now we'll turn to the next speaker. Professor Paul Lerner is a professor of history at the University of Southern California and director of the USC Max Cade Institute for Austrian German Swiss Studies. He's an author of Hysterical Men, Warped Psychiatry and the Politics of Trauma in Germany, and Consuming Temple, Jews, Department Stores, and the Consumer Revolution in Germany. And he edited the books Traumatic Pasts, History, Psychiatry, and Trauma in the Modern Era, Jewish Masculinities, German Jews, Gender and History, Feuchtwanger and Judaism, History, Imagination, Exile, and Jewish consumer culture in the 19th and 20th century, Europe and North America. And Paul Lerner is currently working on a book called Exiles on Main Street, How Central European Refugees Reimagined American Life, 1940, 1970. Sounds very interesting project. Paul, please.
Thank you so much, Guy. Everyone can hear me okay? Okay, great. It's a great honor to be present for the launch of this wonderful book and have been asked to speak on the occasion. Reading over the manuscript has given me the chance to see new works by scholars I've long admired and to become familiar with the writing of others I didn't yet know. Taken together, the essays in this volume present a multiplicity of perspectives, topics, and themes covering several hundred years of German Jewish religious, cultural, intellectual, social, and familial life, which might make the presenter's task difficult, but the editors have succeeded at keeping the contributions tightly focused around several overarching questions, resulting in an uncommonly coherent and compelling set of interventions into German Jewish studies, among other fields. The word generations in the book's title, and we've already heard several my predecessors remarking on this kind of generational phenomenon. I'm going to dig deeper into that. The word generations in the book's title is not there gratuitously. Wallach and Elyada situate the volume self-consciously in a long trajectory of changing views of the German Jewish past, from the emigre generation, which exerted such a profound impact on American views of German history, especially of the Weimar and Nazi periods, through more recent historiographic waves. This approach to the historiography symmetrically echoes earlier works by such scholars as Shulamit Volkov and Michael Brenner, among others, who have stressed the importance of generational change in the German Jewish past itself. So, what I'm trying to articulate here is that we have, on one level, changing historiographic waves, but generation is such an important category in the history itself, as some scholars, some of whom I see on my screen right in front of me right now, have argued in influential works. In one case, for example, the generational shift between what you might call the liberal assimilationist mid-19th century German Jewish fathers and the dissimulationist later 19th and early 20th century sons and daughters. This sets the stage for the remarkable way that the book places historical change and historiographic change in dialogue with each other. Also, on a more personal note now, since that seems to be part of the tone of our conversation today, I was moved to see the acknowledgement of the untimely and tragic passing of two members of this community of scholars, Jonathan Hess and Sharon Gillerman, both of whom I had the pleasure of working with at times closely, and both of whom were part of a group that I'm going to single out here that included Kerry Wallach too, which took as its subject German Jewish popular cultures, which even, I forget exactly what year this started, but the group included, in addition to Jonathan Hess and Sharon Gillerman and Kerry and myself, Lisa Silverman, Klaus Hurdle, Jonathan Skolnick, and several other people. And even at that time, I think maybe some 10 years ago, the idea of focusing on popular culture was still quite new and kind of innovative, given the dominance of kind of works on the great luminaries in German Jewish thought and leaders of German Jewish high culture. In any case, as I said, I was moved that the authors chose to mention these two in particular in the introduction. And I think both of them obviously had a lot more that they would have been contributing to this field and to other fields. But you see their work echoing and reverberating, I think, in multiple ways throughout this collection. For example, Jonathan Hess's work on middlebrow literature, popular culture, gender, spectatorship, or audiences, I should say, and to the ongoing drama and ambivalence of Jewish emancipation. And in the case of Sharon Gillerman, the focus on the body as a site of intervention, on gender and sexuality, and indeed on moving the field beyond older categories and binaries like German and Jewish and assimilation and so forth. I then thought it therefore fitting to include in my remarks where Sharon began her essay on German Jews in the Weimar Republic for the recently published Oxford Handbook of the Weimar Republic, an essay that her husband Mark Quigley and I completed after Sharon's death. And that is with Franz Rosenzweig's 1923 rumination on his own Germanness and Jewishness. As Rosenzweig wrote, "If life were at some stage to torment me and to tear me into these two pieces, I would not be able to survive the operation. I ask not to torment me with this truly life-threatening question, but to leave me whole." Gillerman goes on to write that the idea that Germanness and Jewishness as identities were inextricably intertwined was common for acculturated German Jews before and during the Weimar Republic, and that disentangling these two strands into abstracted categories like the German or the Jew was itself an anti-Semitic trope, and indeed a dangerous anti-Semitic trope during this period. In his epilogue to this collection, Michael Meyer thematizes the hyphen between German and Jewish, noting that these two terms, the two terms on either side of this problematic hyphen, are not stable, discrete categories, but rather entangled and intertwined in a kind of dynamic relationship with each other, which he characterizes as a hybridity. The point is amplified, or a similar point is amplified in the recent collection on the future of the German Jewish past, edited by Gideon Ruveni and Diana Franklin, in which Ruveni updates Leo Baeck's famous pronouncement in the aftermath of the Shoah that the Nazis had brought to an end centuries of German Jewish history. Leo Baeck, of course, could not have predicted the remarkable resurgence of Jewish life in a reunified Germany, nor could he have foreseen the repopulation of hollowed-out Jewish institutions by new waves of emigres and expatriates from the former Soviet Union, Israel, and North America. Today, German Jewish life, if we can even label it that, right? I mean, these labels themselves are problematic and overdetermined. German Jewish life takes place to a great extent in Russian, in Hebrew, and in English, entangled not only between the poles of Germanness and Jewishness, but between Israel, the former Soviet Union, Western Europe, and North America. Indeed, in a moment of rising Christian nationalism, white supremacy, and, as ever, Middle Eastern conflict. To me, that hybridity that Michael Meyer identifies resonates powerfully throughout this collection, which interrogates in different ways at different moments the uniqueness of the German Jewish experience, or the set of German Jewish experiences. When it comes to Yiddish, for example, as we just heard about, religious reform, archival practices, family networks, emigration, memorialization, and so on. My sense is that Kerry and Aya ask, at times, even with, if you don't mind me saying, even with a trace of defensiveness or in a slightly apologetic way, why we keep going back to this well-trodden historical terrain. If this already crowded field can accommodate future generations of dissertations and research projects. It reminds me of the comment people used to make shortly after the reunification that there were more scholars working on the Jews of East Germany than there were East German Jews. But we know that the German Jewish population was itself relatively small, and yet we have this extraordinary concentration of scholars at work producing all the time new studies of the past of German Jews. The essays in this volume, though, demonstrate to me with great clarity that rather than being overfilled, the field is actually thriving. It's reaching a kind of golden age, I would say, with new works coming from, for example, from digital humanities, as we saw here in this volume, new studies of underrepresented and less familiar individuals and groups, or new perspectives on familiar figures using new research tools and methods. New paradigms borrowed, as we see here, for example, with Stefan Vogt, from post-colonial studies, memory studies, linguistics, as again, we just heard about in the case of Yiddish, performance studies, literary studies, and cultural studies, as Abigail talked about, among other fruitful methodologies. Given the state of today's world, with anti-Semitic violence on the rise, with the looming global threat of fascism and other forms of populism, hypernationalism, and authoritarianism, and as the editors point out, ever-increasing numbers of migrants and displaced peoples due to persistent environmental and political crises, the urgency of studying this particular population and set of experiences seems self-evident. What better place than in the German Jewish past, or in German Jewish pasts plural, can we find played out the dilemmas of particularity and universalism amid the promises of the liberal state, a critical engagement with capitalism and its consequences, and a community formed by and destined to embark on endless cycles of migration and rupture. The liminal position of German Jewish studies, as the authors point out, at times too German for Jewish studies and too Jewish for German studies, has itself, I would argue, become a strength, orienting the field itself toward the study of liminality, toward an investigation of the shifting sands of identities, cultural mainstreams, and minoritarian voices in fruitful and compelling ways. The Leo Baeck Institute itself stands at the center of this volume, just as it stands at the center of the field in multiple ways. First, as the volume and several of the individual contributions acknowledge, the funding from the Institute is what sustains new generations of scholars and its infrastructure of support, mentoring, and publicity nurtures new scholarly projects and currents and launches careers, even at this troubled moment in the history of the academic humanities. Second, the Leo Baeck Institute is itself a crucial part of the story of German Jewish history. Guy just called it a miracle, right? That it still exists and in fact flourishes today, right? In particular, of the attempts of emigres and refugees whose lives were shattered by the rise of the Nazis and the Holocaust to preserve and memorialize what was lost. And thus the third dimension of the Leo Baeck Institute's role in this field as an indispensable archive, a repository of the materials we examine again and again in new ways, from new angles, and with new analytical categories, as the field moves forward in line with new scholarly currents. Thanks to DigiBeck and the Institute's extraordinary resources, we can access these materials from our desks in any part of the world. And I wonder, I just pose as a question, is there, maybe to those who have experience in other fields, is there an equivalent institution in another field which exists on these three dimensions, at these three levels, and so intertwined with both the history of the topic itself and the historiography of the topic? So as I come to a close, I want to suggest tapping into a current that runs through this volume, but is perhaps most explicitly articulated in Jason Lustig's contribution, that what distinguishes German Jewish studies as a field and marks its future is its unique level of introspection, or to put it slightly differently, its methodological openness and self-consciousness. I attribute this on one side to its Germanness, to its origins in the national space that pioneered historicism and the professionalization of history as a discipline, yet also to its Jewishness, drawing on unique Jewish notions of history, memory, rupture, diaspora, and destruction and renewal, and owing also to the key influence wielded by the generation of emigre historians who established the field in the North American Academy, leading to new works which locate the dynamics of German Jewish history far afield, on the streets of Jerusalem, the beaches of Southern California, or the communities of Melbourne, just to cite several global examples. The territory this volume charts suggests that a similar degree of theoretical dexterity, introspection, and methodological self-awareness continue to characterize the field, meaning that German Jewish studies has a very bright future indeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you for sharing again our shared view of Leo Baeck Institute, which actually began as a transnational community of refugees and became a transnational community of scholars even before the Zoom enabled us to do what we do today. So without further ado, I will turn now to the members of the younger generation. And the first among the co-editors to speak will be Kerry Wallach. Kerry is an associate professor and chair of the German Studies and an affiliate of the Jewish Studies program at the Gettysburg College in the United States. She's the author of Passing Illusions, Jewish Visibility in Weimar Republic, University of Michigan Press 2017, and numerous articles on German literature, history, film, and visual culture. In addition to being a co-editor of this book, German Jewish Studies Next Generation, she also co-edited a special issue of Feminist German Studies on When Feminism and Anti-Semitism Collide. That will be published in July 2023. The second monograph, Traces of Jewish Artists, The Lost Life of the Work of Rachel Zalit, is forthcoming with Penn State University Press in spring of 2024. In addition, she served the editorial board of the German Jewish Cultures book series published in Indiana University Press, which is supported by the Leo Baeck Institute, London. Kerry, please.
Thank you so much, Guy. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. And also, I'd like to just spend a minute thanking so many people. First, I'm aware that Gerald Westheimer is here on the call today, and I wanted to thank him for all of his support, for all of his scholars working in the field, and for this volume in particular. Billy Weitzer and Frank Mecklenburg, of course, are on this call as well, and they too were involved in this volume, and Frank's foreword is something that you can read if you get your hands on it. Michael Myers here as well. He's been mentioned already. Thank you so much for your wonderful epilogue. And of course, we have some of the contributors on the call today, and I wanted to thank them for working through the pandemic, all of the stress that we've all been under the last few years. They've pushed through it to help make this volume a reality. And of course, I also really wanted to thank both Abigail Gilman and Paul Lerner for their wonderful, incredible responses to the volume, giving us a lot to think about and helping us understand even what we've put together in the book. So, and also contextualizing it within this broader story of generations, both in the history itself and in the scholarship. So thank you so much. I wanted to give a little bit of a backstory about how the volume came together and maybe offer some sort of other comments on how we can think about the different chapters as individual works in the volume. Most of the contributors met at the Association for Jewish Studies in 2019. Some joined virtually to have these conversations about what we could put together in terms of a volume. And we had 2 panels at that conference as well, organized around interdisciplinary approaches in German Jewish studies today and German Jewish texts and contexts. So from the very beginning, we've thought about this volume from a very interdisciplinary viewpoint. I too, I'm more of a cultural studies scholar, I as a historian, so we have an interdisciplinarity between us representing the different, two of the different branches of German Jewish studies. So we're happy and excited about the interdisciplinarity of this book. But we also asked scholars to think about, and I'm glad it came through to some of our readers, to think about in their contributions how they could personally reflect on why German Jewish studies is useful, how it helps them do, and why do they work on this field. But also these bigger, broader questions that we're all asking today, like why does German Jewish history matter, German Jewish culture, and what makes each approach to it distinctive. And so we also see in each chapter sort of richly illuminated these case studies coming from the individual research that each scholar does, and thinking about how their work appeals to the broader public, but also addresses some of these other questions about why German Jewish studies matters and what we can do with it. I am especially excited to echo some of the comments that Abigail made and Paul as well about how I speak now not only as an editor, but also as a contributor to the volume, but how several of our chapters focus on women's biographies, women as some of the minor figures that have been overlooked in German Jewish history and studies, and the impact that gender and sexuality had on women's careers and contributions throughout history. And speaking again as a contributor and responding a little bit to Abigail, for me, my case study that I present in this volume on artist Rachel Shalit Marcus, this gave me an opportunity to think through some of these questions through the lens of one individual and to think about what it means to be German, what it means to be from Germany as a social category, to ask how we can start to expand both geographically and in other ways, linguistically, thinking about what it means to be connected to Germany and German Jewish studies in the broadest possible way, and how transnational and multilingual connections become imperative as we conceive of German Jewish studies in a broader way. So Rachel Shalit Marcus, for example, is an artist who lived in Germany and worked in Germany, and was influenced by the German Jewish art scene, of course, even though she never had German citizenship. So what does it mean to consider her as a German or German enough to be talked about in German Jewish contexts? And I also use her as a way of asking questions about visual culture. What is German Jewish art? What is German Jewish visual culture? If there isn't necessarily a linguistic component to something, how do we know it's German? How do we make it so that it relates to this linguistic context that is often mapped onto German Jewish studies? And we can think about viewing publics and audiences. We can think about the language of titles, but we can also think more broadly when we think about Jewish art in terms of what experiences are reflected in the art and what they show and teach us about the connections of those working in Germany, also to Eastern Europe. And as we look at someone like Shalit Marcus and we think about, in her case, women artists, but also other minor figures who have been omitted from the historical record, how can we do exactly what our commentators have suggested this volume aims to do? How can we think about how these minor figures work to help us do the work of taking this liminal field, this German Jewish studies, sort of by definition anchored in the peripheral. How can we take a field anchored in the peripheral and use minor figures as a way to correct, as a way to begin to rewrite some of these historical narratives that have excluded other figures, whether it's women or other minor figures? We have these broad narratives. Now is the time that we take this field that positions itself almost in a minor way by definition, looking at this liminality, this marginality, and how can we use that as an intervention into the scholarship and do some of the work that hasn't been done yet. So in conclusion, if you're interested in Rachel Shali, just to speak to her again, because that's what I'm immersed in right now, she's an artist who's experiencing a rediscovery more broadly right now. Some of her works are beginning to resurface. It's very exciting. So it's a pivotal moment to include her work in the field of German Jewish studies. It's a pivotal moment to say more broadly, who else is part of our German Jewish studies sort of broad view? Who else are we missing because we've set these parameters? How can we take down, deconstruct some of those parameters and think in a new way about what German Jewish culture looks like? So that's all I want to say. And now we'll hear from the other co-editor.
Thank you, Kerry. Before turning to Aya, I believe we have a few minutes for a few questions and remarks from the audience after Aya will speak. So I invite those of you who are interested to ask, to remark, to write me a direct message in the chat. So after I will speak, I'll have time to a few questions and remarks. So please write to me at a direct message in the chat. So now I will turn to Aya. Aya Elyada is a senior lecturer, Dr. Elyada, senior lecturer of German and German Jewish history and chair of the history department of Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Since 2017, she has served as the academic advisory board of the Elyada Institute Jerusalem and the editorial board of his journal Chidushim, study of history of German and Central European Jewry, which is a Hebrew journal. The publications include articles in German Jewish history, Christian Jewish relations, cultural history of language and translation, and the Yiddish-German encounter. Her book, A Goy Who Speaks Yiddish, Christians and Jewish Language in Early Modern Germany, was published in 2012 with Stanford University Press, and a Colin Book project discusses the place of Old Yiddish literature in modern German Jewish culture. Aya, please.
Thank you very much, Guy, and thank you so much, Paul and Abigail, for wonderful talks. And it was really wonderful to hear them. Thank you. So first of all, I would of course like to join Kerry in all the thank yous to everyone who took part, and especially to Gerald Bestheimer and to Michael Meyer and to all our contributors. I won't repeat what Kerry said, but I will add two more personal remarks maybe. So first of all, as a scholar working in the field of German Jewish history, Leo Baeck Institute has been my second academic home for, 20 years now, since I was in my MA. And but by that, I of course mean the Leo Baeck Institute Jerusalem. And in fact, I never had the opportunity to interact with the Leo Baeck Institute New York, except for applying to the Bestheimer Fellowship and receiving it. But I never really had the opportunity to truly cooperate with them. And this book gave me this opportunity. And I would like to thank Frank and Billy and now Marcus for the really great support. And second, I would like to thank my partner, Kerry. I'm sure that any one of you here who's had the experience of co-editing a book with someone, it can be challenging, it can be frustrating sometimes. And I have to say that with Kerry, it was just a wonderful experience. And Kerry, you restored my faith in the institution of co-editing books together. So thank you for that. And now just a few remarks on the book. So like many of you, I've been in the field of German Jewish studies, German Jewish history for quite a few years now. But I feel that this book was a kind of a watershed for me, because it really made me reflect on the field and contemplate its meaning, its trends, its directions, its importance. And in a way, we can say that Kerry and I, we did it to ourselves. I mean, the original idea was to just ask the various participants to provide a sample of their current project. And it was wonderful. But then we thought, well, why don't we take this opportunity and ask them to do something more? Why don't we ask them to really think about their work inside the field, think about their contribution, think how they engage with the field as a whole. And as contributors and editors, we, of course, did the same. And we did it in three different levels, I would say. So the first level is as contributors, and Kerry also spoke about that. So I also presented, I was also a contributor. I presented a case study from my current book project about the place of old Yiddish studies in modern German Jewish culture. And while I've already situated it within the framework of the Yiddish-German encounter and within the framework of diachronic translation, namely a translation between the early modern and the modern era, I think that at this stage of the project, it was right to really present the project as a whole, to say, okay, so where does it belong in the field? And I then thought that it would be most fitting to put it in the struggle of the German Jews with what historian Ismar Schorsch once called, I really love this quote, the major issue of the emancipation era, namely, what was to be done with the legacy of the past? And Yiddish was, of course, part of this legacy, and how they struggled with it and engaged with it is part of a broader engagement with the pre-modern Jewish past, with the Jewish heritage, part of the effort of what Shulamit Volkov termed the invention of tradition that took place as a major project of modern German Jewish culture and scholarship. And I thought that this is where it fits, and it really gave me the framework to think about it. The second level was as an editor. Once we started getting all the contributions, all the papers from the other authors, I was amazed to see really the diversity and the richness and the potential of the many directions. And it's not that I wasn't aware of the fact that the field was very diverse, but in my own research, we always have our box, our limits, into what we delve and what we leave aside. And here, as an editor, I really had to delve into each and every one of these topics, and I found it really fascinating. Sometimes challenging, I will say. For example, Matt Handelman's really wonderful chapter on digital humanities, where he uses the tools of digital humanities to bring really fascinating insights into how philosophy and thought and philosophical terms within the community of German Jewish scholars, how it worked and how this network really functioned. And at the beginning, I didn't understand it. Like, I didn't understand the idea of what he was doing. And I think we had like back and forth with the paper, which really made it say the conclusions, really bring forward the wonderful insights that this tool allows us to bring. And I think it was an amazing experience for me. I hope that also for Matt. And also the third level, this was in my function as a co-author of the introduction, which Abigail mentioned. And it was the idea to give a survey of the field and its history and its current trends and directions. And then I was quite overwhelmed, because this field, like, how do you summarize such a field? How do you give a meaningful survey? And it reminded me of something that Robert Darnton wrote in 1982 about the field of the history of the book. So just 2 sentences. And so he writes about the history of the book. So rich did it prove, in fact, that it now looks less like a field than a tropical rainforest. The explorer can hardly make his way across it. At every step, he or she becomes entangled in a luxuriant undergrowth of journal articles and disoriented by the crisscrossing of discipline. It was, in short, an interdisciplinarity run riot. And this is how I felt about the field. And we thought, okay, how are we going to bring everything together? Sorry. But then, like Downton, we were determined to put order into this chaos and bring a meaningful survey to our readers, but also to ourselves. And of course, we didn't have to start from scratch. As you can see from the footnotes, we built on the work of previous scholars, we consulted with colleagues, and we have the introduction. So thank you very much, all of you, and thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Aya. We have one question, and then I will ask two of the other contributors of the book, Frank Mecklenburg and Michael Meyer, to say something before we end the discussion. So there's a question from David Goldstein. Do you want to ask yourself, or I can just read it? But if you want, you can ask yourself. Okay, so the question is: what are some aspects of German culture today that can be directly attributed to the contributions of the Jewish population in Germany over time? This is how it's formulated. So is one of you can answer? Can one of you answer on this question? What are some aspects of German culture today that can be directly attributed to the contribution of the Jewish population in Germany over time? Maybe it's such a wide and general question that is difficult to approach. It might be, I just give one example, the culture of memory in Germany today, not only in the context of the Holocaust, but in a wider context, I think can be attributed and connected to the history of German Jewry and, of course, the trauma of the Shoah. But this is, of course, only one perspective. But you know, we might consider and think about this question if you don't have an immediate answer and reflection about it. So, Professor Michael Meyer will be very happy to hear your short remarks.
Thank you very much, Guy. I'm very glad that I was able to participate here to listen to the talks, which were all very interesting, and be, as it were, a representative of the older generation. Mm-hmm. I think what the book shows us is that, as I think you indicated, Guy, that German Jewish studies have a future, and an important future, that there are aspects of the field that deserve further attention, that deserve new attention, that involve rethinking and reimagining. I would hope that there would be future volumes like this one, in future years, that the Westheimer Fellowships would continue to be as productive as this volume has been. And I too want to congratulate Kerry and Aya for producing an important work of Jewish scholarship, and also thank Paul and Abigail for their incisive remarks.
Thank you, Michael. And last but not least, Frank Mecklenburg, please.
Yeah, first of all, I want to thank Aya and Kerry and, of course, Michael Meyer and actually mainly Gerald Westheimer, who is the generator of all of this. I can only second what Michael has been saying. I mean, I take this volume as a sort of Bestandsaufnahme. Sort of, it's a slice in history showing where we have come and where we're going. And as the administrator of this fellowship, I am ecstatic about the success of all of this, and that this is. I was always wondering why this is such a type of fellowship that hasn't really been adopted, given the success of it, you know. So, but who knows? So, thank you. It's great work, actually, by all of you who have been fellows of this fellowship program, and many more. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you for everybody. I think we can shine up and say that we definitely believe that our past has a great future, and maybe futures in plural. And we look forward to see what the next generations will contribute to our dynamic international and transnational dialogue with the past. So good evening, and I wish all of you enjoying reading this interesting and fascinating book. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Guy.
Thank you, Guy.